The grinding vibration of the Nomara station's failing bulkheads always felt like a failing human heart against Rexus Thorne's ribs. He tasted the metallic residue of desperate commerce, old power conduits mixed with the sour tang of stale synthale, the signature scent of a frontier hub clinging to legality by a thread. Rexus sat across from Vex, the Graken debt runner whose shimmering, oil-slick scales were currently twitching with fraudulent sincerity. Vex was outlining the acceptable parameters of a 5% surcharge for delayed delivery of stolen fusion regulators. Rexus registered the data not through sound, but through the kinetic hum felt across the reinforced deck plating, the low-level thrumming that indicated baseline criminal operation. This noise was his comfort zone, the sound of predictable vice. The deep-end bar was a geological layer of interstellar debris, three-dimensional models of chrome maintenance drones, the high-frequency clicks of Zia traders arguing over data streams, and the bartender, a visibly fatigued clone unit, cycling through the motions of service. Rexus tapped the scarred surface of the table, the sound a small hollow counterpoint to Vex's droning explanation. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop, that subtle inflection in the background noise that signaled the game had changed from debt collection to existential threat. The change was not auditory. It was the sudden, total cessation of background activity. It was an amputation of sound. Life support drone, magnetic locks, the Zia chatter, all of it ripped out of existence, leaving a pressurized vacuum where noise should have been. Rexus watched Vex cease mid-word, the Grakon's 4 light-gathering eye stalks drawing inward until the head looked like a blunt stump. The vibrant sheen of the alien scales turned instantly matte, draining all reflected light. The Zia traders froze mid-gossip, their crystalline forms now perfect sculptures of inertia. The clone bartender stopped its slow, deliberate cleaning motion, optical sensors locked rigidly on the main entry point. The air thickened, heavy, not with sound, but with an impossible pressure that forced Rexus's lungs to work harder for every fraction of stale, ionized oxygen. Every non-organic occupant in the room was locked in place by a terror that surpassed panic. It was a systemic shutdown induced by an overwhelming presence. Rexus, a fragile biological anomaly in this sea of petrified aliens, felt the cold wave of dread, immediately chased by the sharp, clinical recognition of absolute danger. The main access bulkhead did not swing open. It dissolved inward, retracting into the ceiling structure with the seamless efficiency of a precision cutting tool. The emergency lighting, a sickly, corrosive purple, illuminated the figure framed in the doorway. The Krill. It was not built for intimidation through size, standing only near 2 meters, but for perfect kinetic expression. Every angle of its chassis was optimized for the kill. Glossy, pitch-black carapace that seemed to absorb the meager light, multi-jointed limbs operating with frictionless grace. There were no eyes, only a smooth expanse of photoreceptor clusters that drank in the environmental data. This was K7, an Apex termination unit, a weapon so specialized its employment signaled terminal political failure or financial insolvency at a stellar level. Its arrival meant the expenditure was beyond calculating. Rexus felt the local thermal regulation dip by a measurable fraction, the creature passively siphoning ambient energy to boost its own systems. Vex was not merely scared. The creature was already dead, merely awaiting the official severance of function. The fear radiating from the assembled clientele was acrid, the smell of overloading biocircuitry. K7 moved precisely 3 paces into the room, its progress silent, its sensory array sweeping over the occupants. It catalogued the Zia, dismissed the paralyzed Grakon, and disregarded the automated clone. It was locking onto a specific biological resonance, an energy bleed that did not belong in the standard operational profile of the station. The focus narrowed, locking onto Rexus Thorn. Rexus understood this finality. The administrative cleanup detail had arrived, and the universe had decided his ledger was overdue. The Krill did not rush. That was the hallmark of a thing that knew evasion was mathematically impossible. Rexus forced himself to draw a slow, deep breath of the recycled, dusty air. He did not reach for the reinforced kinetic blade hidden beneath his worn utility jacket. Instead, Rexus performed an act of pure, defiant absurdity against the flawless logic of the predator. He allowed a thin, professional grimace to spread across his face. Slowly, deliberately, he began to straighten his posture, pushing himself away from the table. The action was a violation of the frozen tableau. As he moved, Rexus consciously flexed his hands, listening to the protest of old cartilage and stressed ligaments, a sharp, distinct percussion in the utter silence. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of a biological machine protesting decay, entirely human, entirely unplanned. "Your coordination seems a bit off today," Rexus stated, his voice sounding coarse and alien in the void of quiet. He made certain the address was intended for the silent, geometric hunter. K7 paused its scan, the subtle interruption suggesting a temporary conflict in its processing loop. Rexus had introduced a human delay. "If you are here for Vex," Rexus continued, indicating the petrified alien with a minimal tilt of his head, "the regulators are unsecured in Bay 7. It's a salvage job, straightforward. If you are here for me, we need to discuss the contingency fee structure. Termination protocols for my designation carry a substantial complexity surcharge." K7 communicated through the low, vibrating pulses that bypassed the tympanic membrane, resonating directly against the central nervous system. A silent, damning verdict. Target confirmation confirmed, elimination projected for minimum expenditure of force. Rexus emitted a sound akin to dry paper tearing, a laugh devoid of humor. Minimum expenditure, a favorite metric of every overreaching planetary administrator and bureaucratic thug, right before they discover the true cost of oversight. But you operate on established procedure, K7. Humanity specializes in the deviation from procedure. He shifted his weight, using the metal table as a temporary, inadequate shield between himself and the hunter. The ache in his knuckles served as a reminder of his own localized, tangible existence. Rexus understood the mathematics of a direct confrontation against an apex krill. It was zero probability of survival without heavy ordnance. His only recourse was to exploit the rigidity of the hunter's protocol, a strategy born from years of navigating unjust, labyrinthine systems. "A point of clarification for your mission parameters, K7, Rexus called out, ensuring his tone remained level, almost tedious. "Does the collateral damage waiver for restricted zones include the incidental vaporization of unsecured bioassets?" The query was a functional lie, a data probe designed to overload the system with irrelevant legality. The Krill, dedicated to perfect compliance, hesitated for precisely 0.7 seconds to cross-reference procedural law against the current spatial coordinates. That fraction of time was Rexus's entire operational window. He did not advance on the hunter. Instead, with a burst of explosive energy, Rexus lunged across the table and seized Vex, leveraging the Grakon's rigid form as a projectile. He hurled the inert alien directly into the primary atmospheric scrubber junction behind the bar. The impact was a sickening, dense thud, immediately followed by the violent, ear-splitting shriek of overloading plasma relays. The bar's weak purple ambient lighting dissolved into a catastrophic, blinding white arc flare. The return of sound was a physical assault, amplified by the short-circuiting conduits. K7, perfectly optimized for the near-dark hunting environment, recoiled fractionally as its optical input receptors were overwhelmed by the uncontrolled photonic discharge. Rexus did not afford the Apex unit the chance to recover its visual calibration. He threw himself over the table, hitting the deck hard, and rolled toward the tight aperture he had mentally tagged hours prior, the ventilation service access, clearly marked Oversight Restricted Access. The hatch was not built for rapid egress. But Rexus moved with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that being alive meant having the chance to be wrong another day. He slammed the emergency release lever down, dropping the hatch just as the air behind him began to vibrate once more with kinetic energy. He heard the clean, sharp thunk of a high-velocity round impacting the metal where his skull had been moments before. Rexus jammed himself through the gap, sealing the plate, plunging instantly into the cold, suffocating blackness of the station's primary infrastructure tunnels. The sound of electrical catastrophe faded, replaced by the grating echo of his own ragged respiration and the metallic scraping of his movement through the narrow conduit. He was not clear, but he had bought the most expensive commodity in the galaxy, a lead time measured in mere moments. The krill would track him, meticulously, but it would have to traverse the same rigid logic loops. As Rexus crawled deeper into the dust-choked darkness, the lingering scent of ozone clinging to his pressure suit, he felt the familiar, dull throb in his knuckles. It was not the glow of triumph, but the low-grade satisfaction of having introduced a catastrophic, idiotic variable into a closed system. Survival, Rexus concluded, was simply the human refusal to accept the finality of a well-reasoned calculation. You could face absolute terror with icy calculation, or you could face it with sheer, unadulterated human spite. Very rarely could you manage both without incurring immediate debt. The scraping of Rexus's boots against the rusted inspection grating was the loudest sound he had ever heard, a frantic counterpoint to the distant, sputtering emergency sirens that the krill's initial disruption had apparently failed to fully silence. The maintenance ducts were a cramped hell of condensation and pressurized failure. The air here was thick with the odor of ancient lubricants and ozone, a heavy, cloying cocktail that scraped the back of his throat. His palms, slick with cold sweat despite the exertion, slipped repeatedly on the slick metal as he hauled his frame through the narrow passage. He needed distance, not miles, but time. Enough time for the krill's complex sensory systems to struggle with the non-linear geometry of the ventilation matrix. He stopped at a junction, pressing his back against a bundle of heavily insulated power conduits that pulsed with a faint, sickening warmth. Through the thin metal plating above, he could hear the faintest ripple of movement. The krill had re-established spatial awareness and was now moving with deliberate system-level analysis. It wouldn't explode the ductwork. That would be inefficient and invite jurisdiction oversight. It would simply calculate the most likely exit vector and wait. Rexus closed his eyes, fighting the urge to gag on the toxic air. His vision, still burned by the photonic discharge back in the deep end, flickered with phantom purple spots. He remembered a briefing from years past, a tactical review detailing the krill deployment doctrine. They were not assassins, they were auditors enforcing payment. The expense of deploying an Apex unit meant the client was either a sector governor or a corporation holding enough influence to bend the core treaties. He wasn't worth this level of response, which meant the original target wasn't Vex or the regulators. The target was always the anomaly. A sudden, unexpected jolt ran through the conduit Rexus leaned against. It wasn't the krill. It was a high-priority systems ping, a data spike channeled directly into the station's structural monitoring network, a signature Rexus recognized with a familiar lurch of cold dread. It was the signal of a Fleet Inquisitor probe, authorized by the Central Directorate. The Krill was the cleanup crew. The Directorate probe was the official investigation. They were here because of the regulators, not because of him. The stolen fusion cores were registered to a decommissioned Directorate vessel, a classification that automatically triggered a high-level political response. He wasn't just a dead man. He was about to become an incidental casualty in an internal review. Rexus fumbled inside his tunic, retrieving the encrypted chronometer. The Directorate probe had docked exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds after K7 initiated lockdown. The timeline was too tight for coincidence. This entire operation, the regulators, Vex's debts, the deployment of the Krill, was a nested set of operations, designed not just to retrieve stolen assets, but to eliminate witnesses who knew the assets' origin. He had stumbled into a high-level administrative purge. A soft, synthesized voice echoed down the metal corridor, bypassing the general station comms and injecting itself directly into the emergency local loop, close enough that Rexus could feel the vibration through the floor plating. Section Delta 9, Maintenance Sector Access Restricted. Unidentified biological contamination detected. All personnel are to stand down and await quarantine assessment. Repeat, stand down. The voice was calm, utterly devoid of inflection, but Rexus knew that tone. It belonged to Elson North, the Directorate's Chief Inspector of Logistical Integrity, a man whose concept of justice was the mathematically perfect eradication of budgetary variance. North didn't care about the Krill. He cared about the paper trail that led back to his own department's negligence regarding the stolen cores. And Rexus Thorn, having survived the Apex unit, was now evidence. Rexus pushed himself away from the conduit, his muscles screaming in protest. He had two immediate threats, the perfect predator following his kinetic signature, and the blindingly logical bureaucracy arriving to classify his entire existence as a system error. He had to choose which death to avoid first. He found a maintenance panel marked Atmospheric Recirculation Override, Sub-Level 7. It was the only way forward that didn't lead directly to the main access shafts, where North's security teams would already have established choke points. He keyed in a string of old shipyard override codes, relics from a long-disbanded deep-core mining syndicate. The panel hissed open, revealing a dizzying drop into an abyss of fans and pipes, smelling intensely of stale, recycled air, the very essence of the station's failing existence. Suddenly, a proximity alert blared directly into Rexus's internal comms, a warning he hadn't authorized. It wasn't from North's team or the Krill. It was a tight beam transmission, encrypted to his personal frequency. A voice cut through the static, feminine and tight with controlled urgency. "Thorn, you are moving directly into a Directorate sweep perimeter. The Krill is incidental. North is mobilizing containment teams at sub-level 7. You need egress, not evasion." Rexus froze, bracing himself against the frame of the open panel. He knew that voice. Sora Witt, a systems analyst who sometimes patched his off-grid transport manifests. "Sora, how did you—" "No time!" she snapped. "The regulator cargo is being rerouted by North's automated freight control. They are pulling it into the primary secure lock, Docking Bay 0. If you want to clear your name, or even just live to see another solar cycle, you need to be on that cargo manifest before the lock cycles in 30 standard minutes." The pressure of the hidden fear, the realization that his survival was tied to recovering the very assets that brought the Directorate down on him, was almost physical. He looked down into the dark, dusty shaft, then back up the narrow tunnel toward the inevitable, silent approach of K7. He was trapped between perfect execution and systemic control. The choice was clear: fight the shadow or expose the master. Rexus pulled the worn data slate from his boot. He needed to get to Docking Bay 0, past the Krill, and through Elson North's immaculate blockade. 30 minutes. He gripped the edge of the access shaft, the metallic cold seeping into his flesh, and let go of the grating. The drop was immediate and sickening, a freefall into mechanical darkness punctuated by the deafening roar of failing industrial fans. The air rushing past Rexus was thick with the grit of decades, instantly scouring the residual ozone from his lungs and replacing it with the choking stench of hot, churning machine oil. He hit the first horizontal support strut with a jarring impact that sent a spike of white-hot agony up his left arm. The pain was a clarifying shock, momentarily overriding the adrenaline slump. He managed to hook his forearm over the strut, swaying precariously above the massive rotating blades of the main axial exhaust fan, which spun with the frantic energy of a machine trying desperately not to fail entirely. He was deep in the guts of Namara, several levels below the standard crew access zones. His objective remained Docking Bay 0, an impossible distance away, and his clock was ticking down from 29 minutes. Rexus activated the low-light emitters on his gauntlet. The beam cut through the oily gloom, revealing the dizzying network of pipes and pressure vents. His initial plan, to use the shaft as a dead zone for the krill, was a partial success. K7 would be delayed by the need to dismantle the access point, but North's tactical teams, informed by the station's internal monitoring, would anticipate movement through standard vertical conduits. He needed a lateral escape, something unexpected. Sora's tight beam transmission flickered again, demanding attention. "Thorn, report. I'm mapping directorate movement vectors. They are isolating sub-level 6. You have to move horizontally through the coolant lines, sector Gamma 14. It's narrow, but it bypasses North's perimeter lockdown." The coolant lines. Rexus remembered the schematics. They carried super-chilled plasma coolant, kept just above freezing point to prevent thermal shock to the station's core systems. The air down here was already cold enough to steal his body heat, but the coolant lines represented rapid, localized thermal catastrophe. He found the access flange for Gamma 14, a heavy disc bolted shut with 12 hex screws, each corroded nearly into permanence. There was no time for careful manipulation. He pulled a small, thermal-charged cutter from his kit, a tool meant for breaching diplomatic safes, not industrial access. The device whined, a sound dangerously high-pitched in the metallic silence of the lower levels, and spat a focused jet of incandescent heat onto the first screw head. The metal glowed cherry red instantly. Rexus cursed the inefficiency. The cutter was designed for surgical cuts, not brute force removal. He managed to shear through 3 screws before the atmosphere shifted again. The air grew thick, heavy with static electricity, raising the fine hairs on his neck. He could hear nothing from K7, but the pressure against the metal seemed to increase, a subtle warping of the structural integrity around him. The krill was close, bypassing the physical obstacles with brute technological superiority, perhaps using magnetic levitation across the duct walls. Rexus slammed his shoulder against the remaining plate. It buckled inward with a tortured screech of tortured metal, but the opening was still too small for his shoulders. He fired the cutter again, desperate, aiming for the hinge points. As the 4th screw vaporized, a section of the plating cracked outward. That was the technical failure point. The sudden release of internal stress caused a cascade reaction. The power conduit he had leaned against moments before, the one still pulsing with sickening warmth, ruptured in a violent spray of superheated vapor and shrapnel, slamming into Rexus's exposed side. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound quickly muffled by the oily air. The kinetic impact drove him forward, scraping his torso across the jagged metal opening, and he tumbled directly into the Gamma 14 coolant conduit. The immediate sensation was not pain, but an absolute paralyzing cold. The coolant, barely above absolute zero, washed over him. His movement ceased instantly. It was like being flash-frozen mid-fall. The thin layers of synthetic insulation on his suit barely held against the thermal shock. He was trapped, encased in rapidly hardening slush, unable to move a limb, unable to draw a full breath. The pain returned seconds later, a screaming, systemic agony as his extremities locked solid. "Thorn, what was that signature spike? Report!" Sora's voice was frantic now, stripped of its professional calm. Rexus tried to answer, but the muscles in his jaw were locked. He could only manage a pathetic, grinding sound against his teeth. Through the thick, translucent layer of frozen coolant coating the inside of the pipe, Rexus saw it. Not K7, but something worse for this environment. Directorate heavy containment armor. Two figures, hulking masses of white ceramite bristling with immobilization projectors, were standing directly over the hole he had made. They were Elson North's auditors. Clad in environment suits rated for deep-core excursions, they moved with heavy, measured strides, their optical arrays glowing an arrogant, clinical blue. One of the armored figures pointed a massive, gauntleted hand at the breach. A synthesized voice, crisp and cold, cut through the emergency loop. This was Elson North himself, coordinating directly. "Contaminant isolated. Thermal signature analysis confirms significant kinetic event. Secure the conduit. Primary objective, asset retrieval. Secondary objective, complete containment of biological anomaly, Thorn. Minimize structural damage." Rexus was a frozen trophy in a glass display case, perfectly situated for retrieval. North hadn't just anticipated his move. He had calculated the exact pressure point Rexus would utilize to escape the krill, turning Rexus's moment of calculated defiance into a perfectly executed capture. The krill was an external variable. North was the internal controlling logic. The Directorate operative produced a handheld laser torch, a tool meant for cutting through bulkheads, not for delicate extraction. He brought the beam low, aiming it squarely at the coolant pipe surrounding Rexus's legs. This was the logistical knife edge. If they cut the pipe wide enough to extract him easily, the massive volume of near-zero coolant would flood the lower levels, destroying vital sensor arrays and potentially compromising the station's primary reactor shielding. A catastrophic, civilization-level failure. If they cut too carefully, Rexus would remain encased until the coolant began to thaw or his circulatory system failed completely. "Sora!" Rexus managed to force out, his voice a barely audible, distorted rasp fighting through frozen vocal cords. "The cores, Bay Zero, they are rigged. Tell me." A moment of agonizing static. Then Sora's voice, laced with grim resignation. "They are rigged, Thorn. North isn't just hiding negligence. He's hiding a deliberate overload sequence. If the cores leave the station, they initiate a timed pulse that wipes the Directorate manifest logs completely. He cleans the books by destroying the evidence off-site. You can't let them reach Bay Zero." The laser torch bit into the pipe, just inches from Rexus's ankle. The metal hissed, not from heat, but from the sudden massive contraction of the surrounding alloy. The freezing process was accelerating. Rexus felt his heart laboring against the systemic shock. He had seconds before the coolant reached a crystalline lock that would shatter bone upon extraction. He had two choices, both leading to ruin: remain encased, wait for the thaw, a process that would take too long, allowing North to secure the cores, or find a way to destroy the localized thermal signature before the beam compromised the pipe integrity entirely. Rexus channeled every remaining microjoule of energy into his left hand, the one slightly less constricted by the coolant sludge near his elbow. He couldn't move his fingers, but he could generate a localized, high-frequency kinetic pulse, a trick usually reserved for unlocking jammed firing pins. He aimed the residual energy at the very point where the Directorate torch was cutting into the pipe. It wasn't an attack on the armor, it was an attack on the heat source itself. With a final, agonizing surge of will, Rexus released the pulse. It was not strong enough to stop the cut, but it was enough to destabilize the thermal emitter in the operative's hand. The laser flickered violently, overloaded by the unexpected feedback loop from Rexus's desperate kinetic discharge. The operative yelped, a purely human sound of shock, and the beam snapped away from the pipe, scorching the adjacent wall with a thick, smoking gouge. That single second of instability was all the window provided. Rexus used the reflexive withdrawal of the operative to violently wrench his arm against the hardening coolant, sacrificing the flesh in his shoulder joint for leverage. The cry of torn muscle and grinding bone was lost in the mechanical turmoil of the ducts, but his body lurched upward, breaking free from the immediate freeze just as the Directorate soldier regained control of his weapon. Rexus scrambled backward, tearing himself away from the gaping hole, his left arm hanging uselessly, already turning an alarming shade of mottled blue-black. He was free but compromised, bleeding internal fluids that were freezing instantly on contact with the ambient air. He slammed the access panel shut, but he couldn't secure it. Before he could even pivot, the tunnel ahead of him, the passage leading towards Sector Gamma 14, was illuminated by a blinding, segmented spotlight. K7 had arrived. It had utilized the thermal anomaly created by the Directorate's torch to pinpoint Rexus's location instantly. The Apex Hunter did not bother with subtlety now. It simply advanced, its dark carapace gleaming under the light, its internal rhythm already accelerating toward the termination sequence. Rexus staggered backward, trapped between the methodical, cold logic of the Directorate closing in from behind and the perfect geometric execution of the Krill blocking the only forward path. The air grew intensely hot, the heavy, electrical hum of K7's approach, and Rexus Thorn, one arm functionally dead, realized he was pinned directly between the two primary systems designed to erase anomalies from the galactic equation. The ambient temperature in the coolant conduit had stabilized into a deep, invasive chill that seemed to bypass his suit entirely, settling directly into the marrow of his bones. The air in the maintenance duct now carried the sterile, pressurized scent of Directorate environmental scrubbers, a scent of institutional cleanliness that felt more threatening than the oil and decay he had just escaped. He pressed himself against the cold metal, the useless, throbbing mass of his left arm, hanging like a dead weight, every muscle fiber screaming against the systemic shock. Rexus Thorn stared down the length of the metallic corridor where K7 stood. The Krill had stopped its forward advance, not because it was uncertain, but because it had processed the two competing threats. The Directorate armor, still visible through the shattered access hole behind him, represented procedure. K7 represented ultimate consequence. The Hunter was waiting for the Directorate to make its move, relying on the bureaucracy to clean the immediate spatial mess before it claimed its primary target. He focused on the data Sora had injected. The cores were rigged for an off-site, untraceable detonation controlled by Elson North. It wasn't just about covering up lost inventory. It was about eliminating a verifiable data trail that pointed directly to high-level Directorate malfeasance. Rexus was no hero defending the station. He was a loose end, threatening the integrity of a galactic administration structure. The sheer scale of the deception, using a contractor-level assassin like the Krill to create chaos, while simultaneously deploying internal security to clean up the evidence, was breathtakingly cynical. He realized his tactical error. He had been trying to defeat the Krill or evade the Directorate. The real target was the cargo itself, the mechanism of North's erasure. Docking Bay Zero was not the exit point, it was the detonation chamber. Rexus ignored the heavy, measured thudding of the Directorate boots closing in from behind. He looked directly at K7, an entity of perfect, unfeeling calculus, and projected his desperation outward. He activated the micro-transmitter on his right gauntlet, flooding the local comms loop with a short burst of corrupted data, not a message, but a pure algorithmic virus designed to find the next logical processing sequence. Sora, I need a clear channel to Bay Zero freight control. Bypass North's lock. Now. The answer came back instantly, tinged with static, the desperation audible even through the digital filter. Thorn, I can't punch through North's encryption layers on the cargo locks from this distance. If I overload his net, the whole station cycles into emergency quarantine lockdown. We'll be sealed in a tomb. Do it, Rexus rasped, ignoring the cold that was beginning to stiffen the useless muscles in his neck. If those cores move past the magnetic shear, North wins. Lockdown is a preferable containment method to mass incineration. He made his choice. He would condemn the thousands of transient beings currently inhabiting Nomara to isolation, rather than allow North to execute an untraceable, system-wide assassination disguised as a salvage recovery. It was a decision predicated on the belief that a predictable containment was superior to chaotic annihilation. Rexus pushed himself off the floor, his good arm already feeling the strain of supporting his weight. He moved toward the krill, not charging, but moving into the dead space between the two converging threats. He knew K7 would not wait for the quarantine to cycle. The krill existed outside standard protocol and would eliminate Rexus before the environmental lockdown could interfere with its primary kill directive. As Rexus took the third step, the air pressure changed violently. Sora's virus hit North's encryption matrix. On the main level, alarm klaxons began to blare, a shrieking counterpoint to the Directorate's synthesized lockdown commands. The station's internal gravity generators stuttered violently as the Directorate systems fought the forced intrusion. K7 reacted instantly to the systemic instability. It didn't attack Rexus. Instead, it shifted its focus to the source of the disruption, the Directorate armor bearing down on Rexus from the rear. The krill recognized the threat of bureaucratic interference disrupting its contract. With unnatural speed, K7 launched itself, not toward Rexus, but toward the two Directorate auditors. The collision was silent, a perfect kinetic event that defied expectation. The krill's leading limb, a blade of unimaginable hardness, struck the lead auditor's chest plate. There was no clang of metal, only a brief, horrifying sound of composite material failing under extreme focused pressure. The first auditor was lifted entirely off the ground and thrown backward down the corridor, crumpling against the junction box Rexus had narrowly avoided earlier. Shrapnel and electrical discharge erupted where the armor struck the junction. The second auditor raised its immobilization projector, firing a wide-spectrum dampening field. K7 moved through the field, its kinetic dampeners somehow absorbing the energy pulse, and retaliated, driving its secondary limbs into the joints of the auditor's neck seal. The heavy armor shuddered, then went entirely dark, its internal systems fried by direct neural overload. K7 had eliminated the secondary threat in less than 4 seconds, ensuring no witnesses to its target. It turned back to Rexus, its photoreceptors now glowing with a steady, predatory red light, the brief diversion complete. Rexus felt the sickening realization settle in. Sora's intervention, intended to save him, had served only to justify K7's efficiency. He had sacrificed the station's operational stability to force a confrontation, and in doing so had shown the Apex Hunter exactly how to clear the field of bureaucratic interference. The station lights flickered violently, the gravity generators cycling down in a final desperate attempt to seal the system. Nomara was going dark, starving of power, sealing its bulkheads against the rising tide of external communication, effectively trapping Rexus inside with the perfect killer. Thorn, Sora's voice was a broken whisper over the dying comms loop. The cargo locks are initiating the override sequence manually. North is bypassing the digital quarantine. Bay Zero is cycling in 90 seconds. You have no time for extraction. You have to stop the cores. There. Rexus looked at the krill, which was now closing the distance slowly, deliberately, its movement suggesting that its core programming dictated a clean, final severance rather than a rushed kill. He looked at his useless left arm. 90 seconds to reach Bay Zero from several levels below while being hunted by a perfect instrument of death. There was no lateral escape. There was no maneuvering. The tactical board had dissolved. The only remaining option was absolute, irrational commitment to the objective. Rexus shoved himself away from the wall, ignoring the immediate surge of pain in his shoulder. He ran toward the krill, directly into the path of its inevitable strike. This was not an attempt to defeat K7. It was a calculated maneuver to ensure he reached the target before the hunter reached him. He needed to force the engagement into the most confined, volatile space possible. If he could destroy the cores before K7's termination protocol completed, the mission parameters would be voided, and the krill would default to non-pursuit status, a temporary reprieve. He rounded a corner, the heavy magnetic boots of the Directorate auditors dragging uselessly on the floor behind him. Their power dead, yet their corpses remaining as a testament to the krill's ruthlessness. Rexus reached the main vertical drop shaft, the one leading directly toward the core services and Bay Zero. He didn't use the ladder. He vaulted over the safety railing and dropped into the central shaft, initiating a controlled freefall descent, using his one good arm and the friction of his boots against the emergency braking rail to bleed off speed in massive, jarring increments. He was trading survival for momentum. The descent was a screaming blur of metal shearing past his face mask. He was a projectile aimed at the heart of North's conspiracy, and K7, recognizing the target shift, followed immediately, leaping into the shaft with terrifying grace, instantly gaining on the wounded, slower biological anomaly. The timer for Bay Zero ticked relentlessly in his internal display. 60 seconds remaining. Rexus Thorn had committed to a terminal trajectory, banking everything on whether he could detonate a nuclear-grade conspiracy before a flawless machine could terminate him. The descent stopped being controlled friction and became uncontrolled deceleration as the emergency braking rail vaporized beneath the friction burn of Rexus's singular grip. He shot past the section of conduit where the Directorate auditors lay dead, their armored shells sparking uselessly in the plummeting darkness. The speed was too high, far exceeding safe structural tolerances. The air rushing past his visor was a solid wall, and he felt the familiar, crushing weight of impending impact, the universe enforcing its hard physical laws upon his defiance. He slammed onto a horizontal truss meant for maintenance drones, the impact radiating through his surviving right arm and sending a wave of nausea through his core. His ribs screamed in protest, a chorus of broken structure against the metallic clang. He was alive, but the fall had cost him precious seconds, and the structural integrity of his suit was now compromised, stress fractures spiderwebbing across the neck seal. 30 seconds. Docking Bay Zero. He forced himself into a low crouch, every movement a negotiation with immediate collapse. The overwhelming exhaustion, the cumulative fatigue of the last 72 hours of near-fatal evasion settled upon him like cold lead. This wasn't the adrenaline spike of survival. This was the crushing reality of being fundamentally outmatched. He saw the entire sequence clearly. K7 would reach him first, efficiently dispatching the obstacle. Then, the krill would secure the area, and Elson North, operating from the relative safety of the control center, would initiate the charge sequence on the cores from Bay Zero, wiping the slate clean with a localized energy pulse that would consume the station, Rexus, and the krill in the same sterile flash. A perfect administrative solution. Rexus Thorn was not a strategist, he realized with a clarity born of total failure. He was a contingency, a necessary evil, who had just managed to draw the executioner's attention away from the real target, for just long enough for the executioner to complete its secondary task unimpeded. He had been so focused on avoiding the immediate termination by K7 that he had facilitated North's grander betrayal. The thought was a bitter chemical taste rising in his throat. He had sacrificed the lives of thousands of station occupants. The quarantine Sora warned about was not a possibility, but a certainty now. To buy time that he had immediately squandered in the fall. He dragged himself forward, the gravity generators phasing in and out of stability, causing the deck plating to subtly shift beneath his boots, further throwing off his balance. His right hand was the only tool he possessed, and it was shaking violently, not from cold, but from sheer depletion. 10 seconds. Docking Bay 0 was now visible through the open maintenance aperture ahead, a vast cavernous space lit by the harsh operational white lamps required for external transport docking. In the center, suspended by magnetic clamps, were the targeted fusion regulators, bulky canisters radiating an unnerving low-level heat. A single figure stood near the primary loading ramp, Elson North himself, clad in a crisp, immaculate directorate uniform, holding a simple, unmarked data interface, the remote detonator. He looked entirely unconcerned by the chaos engulfing the lower levels, confident in the absolute superiority of his logistical planning. K7 landed silently behind Rexus, 3 meters back, a dark void against the industrial white light of the bay. It had not rushed. It had maintained the optimal kill distance, knowing the terminal sequence was already in motion. The Krill knew Rexus had lost. Rexus halted at the edge of the bay, panting raggedly, his vision tunneling. The pain in his shoulder was a continuous, roaring static that drowned out all thought except the immediate, crushing weight of failure. He looked at K7, then at North, who glanced back over his shoulder, noticing the hunter's arrival with a flicker of professional acknowledgement, but making no move to accelerate the core detonation. North was patient. He knew the Krill would neutralize Rexus before the timer expired. 5 seconds. Rexus had no weapon left, no viable tactic, and no mobility. He was finished. The thought was not one of terror, but of profound, aching emptiness. He had clawed his way through layers of corruption, not for justice, but for the petty survival of one small human anomaly, and it had cost everything. North raised the interface slightly, a preparatory gesture. In that instant of absolute defeat, a final, desperate correlation snapped into Rexus's exhausted mind. He remembered the initial design specifications for the directorate regulators, not just their output, but their fail-safe cooling mechanism, a secondary system designed to prevent thermal runaway during off-core storage. It required a precise external kinetic pulse, a specific vibrational frequency to initiate emergency shutdown, a protocol so obscure only the original engineers would know it. It was a trick, a final buried piece of bureaucracy designed to stop a core breach if an unauthorized personnel initiated the magnetic transfer. North hadn't accounted for this obscure manual failsafe because his plan relied on a total, system-wide energy purge, which would naturally override the localized cooling shunt. Rexus didn't look at the Krill, didn't look at North. He focused his entire remaining will onto his functional right hand. He didn't have the tools for the precise kinetic frequency. He had only his own body. He slammed his open palm against the nearest structural support pillar, a thick, resonating beam of polymerized titanium alloy, and unleashed every ounce of focused muscle memory he possessed, not into a punch, but into generating a complex, rhythmic vibration. It was a physical scream, an attempt to replicate an encryption key using only bone and sinew against solid metal. The sound was hideous, a deep, resonant thrum-thrum-thrum-thum that was entirely out of phase with the station's dying operational hum. The Krill, which had been advancing for the kill, suddenly locked up mid-stride. The specific frequency resonated through K7's complex kinetic dampeners, causing a catastrophic feedback loop in its movement matrix. The apex hunter seized, twitching violently, its perfect locomotion reduced to a terrifying, involuntary spasm. The noise, however, had not gone unnoticed by the man holding the detonator. Elson North's head snapped toward the sound, his composure finally shattering. He recognized the precise, non-standard vibration immediately. It was a forgotten signature from an old Directorate audit procedure, something buried deep in the legacy code. North's eyes widened, not in fear of Rexus, but in the sudden understanding that his guaranteed clean slate was being manually overridden by a wounded scavenger. 3 seconds. North frantically mashed the activation sequence on the interface. Rexus, his right hand now numb and possibly broken from the impact, forced his focus back to the regulators. The thrumming had worked. A faint, secondary locking mechanism audibly clicked on the fusion cores. The emergency cooling sequence engaging. The internal detonation timer was halted, replaced by a hard lock safety procedure. 1 second. North's thumb depressed the final sequence. Nothing happened. The fusion cores remained humming, locked, inert. The silence returned, heavier than before. But this time, it was a silence of failure, not anticipation. North stared at the interface, then slowly, deliberately, looked up at Rexus Thorn, who stood shivering, leaning against the vibrating pillar, bleeding profusely, facing down a perfect machine that was currently seizing mid-movement. The defeat was absolute. Rexus had failed to escape. He had failed to retrieve the evidence cleanly. He had sacrificed the stability of the station. But in the very last microsecond, by forcing a near-impossible technical interaction, he had negated the final, devastating consequence of the conspiracy. He had not won. He had merely made the defeat survivable. North's face, usually a mask of bureaucratic calm, twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. He dropped the useless interface, reached instead for a sidearm holstered at his hip, a standard-issue Directorate heavy kinetic pistol, and aimed it not at the immobilized Krill, but directly at Rexus Thorn. "You are an unsustainable variable, Thorn," North stated, his voice dangerously low, cutting through the dying station noise. "You do not deserve the dignity of being purged cleanly." The hammer of the Directorate pistol began to cycle, the sound sharp and precise in the cavernous bay. K7 was still locked in its seizure, vibrating uncontrollably, unable to defend its target. Rexus could only watch, his body failing, as the ultimate instrument of justice was rendered inert by a phantom frequency, leaving him alone against the man who had ordered the slaughter. The only thing left was the final, unavoidable bullet fired by a man who preferred localized error to systemic accountability. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. Rexus did not wait for the auditory cue of the hammer falling. The sheer proximity of North's rage meant the next action would be immediate, kinetic, and final. He had bought time by exploiting a loophole in administrative law applied to energy containment. Now, he had to exploit the fundamental weakness of bureaucracy, personnel redundancy. He let go of the vibrating pillar, letting the resulting pain surge up his arm, and initiated a deliberate, staggered fall toward the immobilized Krill unit. K7 was still twitching, its high-level processing systems caught in a loop of conflicting kinetic commands, a statue convulsing in slow motion. The Krill was functionally neutralized, but its carapace remained impervious to the pistol fire North intended for Rexus. North's first shot roared through the bay, the heavy kinetic slug impacting the deck plating inches from Rexus's exposed head. Sparks erupted, not the clean blue of plasma overload, but the ugly, greasy yellow of spent explosive propellant hitting aged alloy. The sound was deafening in the relative quiet of the disabled life support systems. Rexus used the momentum of his own fall, tucking his shoulder and rolling directly beneath the seizing Krill. He was now shielded on three sides by the twitching body of K7, by the heavy magnetic clamps holding the fusion regulators above, and by the solid mass of the Krill's own termination field, which remained partially active despite the system seizure. "You cannot eliminate the variable if you cannot define the equation, North," Rexus shouted, his voice cracking from the strain, the words thin and pathetic against the backdrop of the massive bay. North fired again, a burst of 3 rapid shots intended to eliminate Rexus before he could utilize the Krill as cover. The Directorate officer was precise. One round grazed Rexus's thigh armor, shearing away the outer layer and delivering a dull, stunning impact, momentarily paralyzing the leg. The other 2 rounds struck the Krill's carapace, where Rexus had been a microsecond before. The Krill absorbed the impacts with a faint, dull thud-thud, registering as minor environmental interference rather than threats. Rexus ignored the searing pain in his leg. His objective was singular: the Krill's proximity interface port, a maintenance access point usually sealed by layers of crystalline resin. He jammed his functioning right hand, knuckles protesting violently, into the space between the Krill's uppermost leg joint and the floor plate. He wasn't trying to detach the limb. He was leveraging the small gap to apply maximum torque against the Krill's operational matrix core, which sat millimeters beneath the surface. He needed to force a catastrophic hardware failure, not just a software loop. He twisted his hand, utilizing the weight of his failing body against the rigidity of the alien chassis. It was the ultimate gamble. If the Krill rebooted before he could execute the forced shutdown, Rexus would be crushed between 2 implacable forces, North's firearm and K7's natural termination drive. The Krill shuddered violently. The previous rhythmic seizure fractured into random, uncontrolled spasms. A high-pitched, almost inaudible whine emanated from its shell, a sound of pure internal distress. Rexus felt the Krill's biological dampeners briefly kick back online, attempting to fight the physical intrusion. This was the moment. Rexus located the emergency manual override conduit, a thin fiber optic line, nearly invisible against the black shell, designed only for deep diagnostic retrieval by other Krill units. With his bleeding, trembling fingers, he tore the line free. It snapped with a sound like tearing reinforced silk. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The spasmodic twitching ceased. The Krill went utterly, perfectly still, its internal power signature collapsing to 0. It did not power down. It died mid-computation, a monument to perfect instantaneous failure. Elson North stopped firing. He stared at the silent apex predator, his face losing all trace of bureaucratic disdain, replaced by a raw, sputtering disbelief. He had anticipated Rexus's death, not the destruction of his hired executioner. "You destroyed it?" North whispered, the quiet shock of seeing the galaxy's most advanced hunter neutralized by brute force momentarily freezing his trigger finger. Rexus didn't answer. He pushed himself off the dead machine, ignoring the searing burn in his thigh. He hauled himself upright, leaning heavily against the cold, inert body of K7. He was no longer bleeding profusely from the neck seal. The minor fracture had sealed itself under the internal pressure, but his suit was failing in a dozen minor critical ways. His visibility was reduced by a thin, oily film smeared across the visor. "It wasn't the only asset you controlled, North," Rexus managed, his voice strained, now entirely focused on the true objective, the political weight of the evidence. Rexus took 3 agonizing, lurching steps toward the fusion regulators. He reached the magnetic clamps holding the massive canisters. They were still locked down, the thermal runaway aborted. But the data tapes that contained the Directorate's authorization codes for the quarantine, the very reason for this entire station's existence, were stored in the primary regulator housing. North recovered his focus. He aimed the pistol again, no longer tentative. The quarantine goes live in 180 seconds, Thorn, regardless of the cause. Your sacrifice was wasted. Rexus knew North was referring to the automated activation sequence initiated hours ago, the final political failsafe. Even without the station exploding, the blockade would seal, and the quarantine zone would begin its inevitable attrition against the outer colonies. Rexus ignored the threat. He located the access panel on the regulator housing, a plate secured by 5 heavy-duty magnetic bolts. He had no time for tools. He braced his failing left shoulder against the titanium plating and drove his functional right fist, the one that had just killed the krill, into the seam where the housing met the main power conduit. He wasn't trying to open it. He was trying to shatter the connection. The metal groaned under the impact. A sound of immense strain. He struck again, pouring the last reserves of energy and spite into the blow. The structural integrity failed. A cascade of internal sparks erupted from the seam, not the grand explosion North had planned, but a violent, localized electrical discharge as the physical link to the station's mainframe was violently severed. The evidence tapes, yanked from the live network, were physically ejected by the force, spitting out onto the deck plating like spent cartridges. Rexus collapsed onto his knees beside the scattered data modules. He secured 3 of them, the ones with the highest level encryption visible on their casings, cramming them into a reinforced pouch on his belt. The remaining 2 modules skittered across the deck toward the open ramp leading outside, destined for the vacuum or the maintenance sweepers. North fired immediately as Rexus secured the final data packet. The kinetic round struck Rexus squarely in the left side of his torso, bypassing the compromised area of the right shoulder and slamming him sideways against the inert body of K7. The impact stole his breath, ripped through his remaining viable organs, and sent a wave of blinding white pain that eclipsed even the fatigue. Rexus Thorn slumped against the cold, dead carapace of the apex hunter. He was paralyzed, unable to lift his head, unable to confirm the extent of the internal hemorrhaging. The harsh white lights of Docking Bay Zero seemed to swim through a thickening red haze. Elson North walked toward him, the heavy pistol steady in his hand, his uniform now smudged with residual grime from the bay environment, a tiny concession to the chaos Rexus had wrought. North did not look triumphant. He looked intensely practical, surveying the damage, the dead krill, the inert fusion cores, the scattering of crucial data tapes. You stopped the immediate detonation, North conceded, standing over the prone figure. Admirable, if ultimately pointless. The quarantine protocols are autonomous. The fleet will execute the dispersal mandate regardless of localized power failures. You bought a few hours of localized panic, Thorn. Nothing more. He paused, looking down at the man who had single-handedly dismantled his perfect endgame. The Directorate rewards foresight, not stubbornness. You have only delayed the inevitable, and you have guaranteed that the ensuing investigation will discover every compromise you made to get this far. North raised the pistol one last time, aiming for the neck seal, the final, precise severing of the anomaly. But as Rexus lay gasping in the toxic stillness of the bay, staring up at the colossal, dead bulk of K7 resting next to him, he didn't see North. He saw the fractured, spider-webbed stress lines webbing across his own visor, and beyond them, the stars, cold and indifferent. He had saved the data, but he had destroyed his only reliable escape vector, the station's primary transport system, overloaded and vaporized by the desperate surge needed to stop the cause. He had killed the hunter, neutralized the immediate threat of incineration, and exposed the conspiracy. Yet he was stranded, bleeding out, with the entire Directorate fleet slated to seal the sector in less than 3 hours. Rexus Thorn had survived the climax, only to find himself utterly alone on a dying space station, holding evidence that would likely die with him, listening to the approaching high-frequency whine of automated enforcement drones beginning their ascent from the orbital perimeter. The war against the system had been momentarily paused, but the cost had rendered survival irrelevant. The sound died last. It was not a fading tone, but an abrupt subtraction, like a power cell violently ejected from a core. The alarms sputtered into silence, the hiss of damaged atmospheric seals resolving into a thick, suffocating stillness. Elson North's final shot, the one that punched through Rexus's left side, had not sounded loud. The shockwave had simply arrived late. A dull, deep pressure that settled in the marrow of Rexus's bones. He hung suspended against the inert bulk of the Krill, K7, the apex predator, now nothing more than a complex arrangement of inert material. The 3 data modules pressed hard against his belt, the only tangible evidence that the last 72 hours had been anything other than an episode of localized system failure. Rexus fought for the simplest biological function, inhalation. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of burnt insulation and the lingering clinical scent of dead krill processing fluid. His left lung fought the pressure of the internal wound, responding sluggishly, a failing piston in an ancient engine. He tried to shift, to roll away from the dead weapon, but his body refused the command, held captive by pain and system shock. He looked past the wreckage of the fight, past the frozen, stunned expression of Elson North, who remained fixed above him, pistol lowered slightly. North was a mid-level administrator elevated by crisis, a man whose control rested entirely on the illusion of predictable consequence. Rexus had provided the antithesis of predictability. "It is over, Thorn," North stated, the pragmatic exhaustion clear in his tone. "The data is secondary now. The fleet is inbound. You are marooned. The quarantine will stand. You have proven nothing except your inability to die quickly." Rexus managed to turn his head infinitesimally, focusing his degraded vision on the vast, curved viewport of Docking Bay Zero. Outside, the starfield remained, vast and uncaring. He could see the faint, almost imperceptible flicker of distant patrol signatures, the Directorate's hammer already swinging toward this failing hub. He had won the skirmish. He had eliminated the immediate threat, secured the inconvenient truth, and proved that even the most perfect mechanism could be defeated by a precisely timed act of destructive stupidity. But victory on this scale was only a marginal delay of execution. His vessel, the Anvil, was slagged in orbit. His co-conspirator, Sora Witt, was likely already in custody or space dust. He was holding secrets that now had no immediate delivery mechanism. He was a loose end in a cleanup operation already in progress. Rexus pushed against the cold, smooth plating of the Krill. The dead machine offered no resistance, absorbing his weight like cold iron. He managed to slide free, collapsing onto the deck plating, the 3 data modules digging painfully into his hip. He was breathing shallowly now, his consciousness beginning its slow, reluctant retreat from the edges of immediate awareness. He raised his right hand, the one that had torn the fiber optic cable, the one that had battered the housing. It was trembling violently, not from adrenaline, but from sheer systemic exhaustion. He looked at the scarred knuckles, the same ones he had cracked in the deep-end bar hours before, the sound resonating with defiant life against the paralyzing silence of the Krill's arrival. The difference now was profound. Then, the cracking had been an act of assertion, a biological punctuation mark against alien perfection. Now it was the sound of worn biological components failing under stress. The noise of decay accelerated. He was not a hero of the colonies. He was a courier who had botched the handoff and then violently disrupted the receiving party. He had traded his life expectancy for 3 small cubes of crystallized memory. That was the final accounting. Rexus felt the metallic residue of old synth ale on his tongue again, the phantom taste from the bar. But this time it was mixed with the overpowering copper tang of his own blood. The scent of the frontier, the smell of low-grade commerce and necessary compromise, returned as the station's failing emergency systems began their desperate, scheduled attempts at stabilization. A low, cyclical hum, starting up in the external bulkheads, an artificial heartbeat trying to deny the incoming quietus. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of one of the data modules. It was cold, solid, real. He managed a whisper, not directed at North, but at the endless, indifferent void outside. The regulations, they always account for the loss of product, never the cost of the delivery boy. He closed his eyes against the swimming white light. The Directorate drones would arrive soon, efficient and merciless, to process the wreckage and re-establish the official narrative. The whispers of his resistance would be scrubbed clean by the coming administrative sweep, leaving only the official record of a station malfunction and a high-value asset neutralized. Rexus Thorn would become an administrative footnote, filed away in the same deep archive where the true quarantine codes resided. He had traded the chaos of the immediate moment for the profound, inevitable isolation of the aftermath. He had survived the fight, only to be defeated by the peace that followed. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.